Hello, I'm Paul LaRoche, and this is Hidden Heritage. In the last episode, I premiered Chapter 1 of the book Hidden Heritage, the story of Paul LaRoche. Join me now as we continue this new podcast series. Hidden Heritage, written by Barbara Marshak, narrated by Paul LaRoche. Chapter 2, A Piece of the Puzzle. Working full-time for a few years brought a regular paycheck, but it didn't bring the satisfaction of creating sweet sounds on a keyboard or seeing someone's eyes light up at an upbeat mix of melodious harmony. But that was in the past. Without music in his life, Paul convinced himself he had no choice but to cave in and do things the corporate way. Education, career, retirement. He would adhere to society's rules by establishing a good home for his wife and kids. The bigger the better, right? The more luxuries, the easier life would be. Isn't that the American way? The economics of the early 1990s skyrocketed home prices across the Twin Cities, and an Eden Prairie zip code only added to the high cost of living. Paul realized their typical suburban home was more than they could realistically afford. They diligently scrimped and saved each month to make the mortgage payment. Before they knew it, Paul had to sell the house and move the family back into an apartment. They could only afford a 2-bedroom. So Paul and Kathy gave the kids each a room of their own, and they slept on a hide-a-bed in the living room. It wasn't ideal, but they could make it work. It was getting harder for Paul to go to work every day. Running the city rat race at full speed didn't yield any professional satisfaction. Instead, it left an emptiness, a deep spiritual void. It had been 6 years since his parents' death. Off and on, Kathy brought up the adoption papers, but he simply wasn't ready. Besides, what good would it do? Normally, Paul viewed late autumn in Minnesota as one of the most beautiful times of the year, when the clumps of woodlands surrounding the comfortable neighborhood were alive with brilliant shades of red, yellow, orange, and brown. Fall reminded him of the season when he and Kathy first fell in love. But this October, the falling leaves presented nothing more than a stark reminder of another cold, dark winter lurking just around the corner. Sometimes alcohol diminished the frustrated thoughts in his mind. Other days, that didn't even work. A depression set in that Paul couldn't seem to shake. Outwardly, nothing had changed in Paul's appearance, but as only a wife of 18 years could see, Kathy knew he was deteriorating on the inside, leaving nothing more than a shell of the man she loved. Hard as he'd tried to fit the corporate mold, he simply didn't. A part of him wanted to let his hair grow longer, but it caused issues at work, so he kept it cut short. He was fighting to be himself and running into obstacles at every turn. He didn't understand any of it. Sensitive to Paul's needs, Kathy couldn't stand to see him like this. She thought of the adoption papers again. One evening she approached Paul as he laid on the couch, eyes closed, shutting out the world around him. "Paul, we need to talk," she said softly. Paul exhaled slowly, but said nothing. "Paul," Kathy stressed, "I know we've talked about it before, but I think for some reason if you find your biological family and go through this process, it will help you deal with whatever you're feeling inside." He remained silent, contemplating her words. "You're not happy." Kathy tenderly touched his forearm. "I can see it. The kids can see it. I think it's affecting Nicole. She argues with me constantly about school, her friends, and everything. Nicole is just independent. It's more than that, Paul. She's also smart. She can see something is going on with you. We can't go on like this, watching you waste away before our eyes." Maybe Kathy was right. He rolled onto his side and opened his eyes. I don't know what good it'll do, he said honestly. I don't know either, but let's try, Kathy pleaded. What have we got to lose? Paul glanced up at Kathy, her eyes now moist with tears. He loved her with all his heart. She'd been there to support him all these years. He trusted her judgment. If she thought this would help, then he'd try. All right, he said, giving in to her persistence. See what you can find out. This will be good for you, Paul, Kathy sighed with relief. I'll start with Yvonne. Paul's older cousin, Yvonne Linster, who had lived with Irma and Clarence before Mark and Paul were adopted, had connections with the sisters from St. Mary's Hospital in Pierre when she worked there as an X-ray technician in the 1960s. Shortly after Kathy had discovered the papers, Yvonne had approached Paul at a holiday dinner. Come and talk to me if you ever decide to pursue this, she whispered. I know some things. Really? He half inquired. For one thing, you're part Indian. Paul heard her words but simply shrugged them off. Kathy pulled open the drawer on Irma's kidney-shaped desk, now in their living room, and retrieved the adoption papers, the only piece of the puzzle they had. It would likely take years to find Paul's biological parents, but at least she could start. Kathy dug out her address book with Yvonne's number and dialed. Hi, Yvonne. It's Kathy. Say, Paul and I were talking tonight. Do you think you could make some phone calls and see if you could find anything out about Paul's birth mother? She asked. Yeah, I think maybe I could, Yvonne replied. Do you have a pen? Yep, got one right here. Okay, Kathy said. His birth name was Arlen Fay LaRoche, L-A-R-O-C-H-E. L-A-R-O-C-H-E, Yvonne repeated. And his birthday? June 23rd, 1955. Okay, Yvonne said. I'll make some calls. I certainly know where to start. A couple of days later, Yvonne called Kathy back. Here it goes, Yvonne stated. I called my friend and asked her to check the records at St. Mary's Hospital. She traced Paul's name and date of birth and found the parents' names. Let's see, she said, pausing. She flipped a notebook page. Here, the mother's name is Bessie Arlene LaRoche, and the father is listed as Fred Daniel LaRoche. Say that again, Kathy said, writing the names down as fast as Yvonne talked. Bessie Arlene LaRoche and Fred Daniel LaRoche, she repeated. I called information and found a phone number for a Fred LaRoche, she continued. Yeah, Kathy said impatiently. He's in a small reservation town called Lower Brule, not in Pierre, Yvonne advised. Lower what? Brule, B-R-U-L-E. I called the number and talked to a woman named Sherelle. First, I asked to speak to Arlene LaRoche, and she told me that she had died a number of years ago, Yvonne said. Kathy glanced at Paul, hiding her immediate disappointment. We're too late. His mother is already gone, Kathy thought to herself. So then I asked to speak to Fred LaRoche, and she told me that there's more than one Fred LaRoche. Really? Kathy asked with surprise. I said I was looking for Arlene's husband, and she said he passed away several years ago as well. Oh no, Kathy cried. They're both gone, she thought to herself. We kept talking, and she finally put her husband on the phone. His name is also Fred LaRoche, but goes by Fritz. Fred LaRoche was his dad. I explained I was calling for you, to find out about Paul's birth mother. We talked for quite a while. I asked several questions because I wanted to make sure I had the right family. It's obvious this Fred LaRoche is too young to be Paul's father. Kathy breathed another sigh of disappointment. But I think it's his brother, she said. Really? Kathy's heart began to beat faster. A brother? I want to warn you, though, Yvonne said, hesitating momentarily. What? Kathy said. What else did you find? Well, they're Indians. Kathy brushed the comment aside. What mattered was that they were close to finding Paul's family. Do you remember the number? She asked impatiently. Kathy scribbled it down on a piece of paper and thanked Yvonne for her help. She whirled around to face Paul. I can't believe it. She thinks she found your brother, Kathy announced, her eyes wide with excitement. She joined Paul in the living room. Really? He asked. He looked at Kathy, waiting, anticipating her next words. I'm sorry, hon, she said, reaching for Paul's hand. It sounds like both your parents are gone. Kathy sat down beside him on the couch and put one arm around Paul's shoulder, gently caressing his neck. Paul ran his fingers through his hair and nodded with acknowledgement. Oh, man, he whispered. Kathy held him tightly while he absorbed the news. An undefined feeling, a sense, passed through him. All his life he'd never known anything about his birth parents, and here, in one phone call, Paul found out he would never meet them. Paul rose to his feet and paced from the kitchen to the living room and back. Now what? It all happened so quickly. He didn't quite know what to do. Most people spend months or years searching for their biological family. Here it had only been a matter of days and they had a contact. It simply defied the odds. I think we should wait a while before we call, Paul finally said, tucking his hands into his jean pockets. Paul? Kathy exclaimed, jumping to her feet. She could hear the doubt and uncertainty in his voice. This is what we want. You can have some answers. Don't you want that? She held her hands in the air, waiting for his reply. Sure I do, he said, but the tone of his voice belied his own words. We've waited so long. What's a few more days? Kathy shook her head and started unloading the dishwasher. Holding his thoughts inside, Paul wondered what this unearthing might mean. If anyone knew anything about American history, there was plenty to be concerned about. When the Native Americans were taken from their homelands and placed on reservations, their whole way of life was taken away from them as well. The last few generations were raised on government handouts and the belief that their American Indian heritage was unimportant, even shameful. With the loss of their culture and the self-supporting lifestyle, many individuals succumbed to the negative plagues that affected the reservations: alcohol, dysfunction, unemployment. It was time to make up his mind that he could and would accept whatever he found, good or bad. There was no guarantee what they would uncover. Yet another thought haunted him even more: rejection. He was too late to meet his parents, but what if the others didn't want him to simply show up after all these years? They'd gave him up once before. They must have had a good reason. Family scandal? Poverty? Maybe they didn't want him back. The distressing thoughts tore at Paul's state of mind. He simply didn't know if he could handle it. Kathy lifted the clean plates into the cupboard and closed the doors. She leaned her back against the counter and faced her husband. Paul, I believe with all my heart this is the right thing to do. They'll want us to come back, she insisted, her blue eyes pleading for understanding. I just feel it. And no matter what we find, we should accept that. Paul stepped closer and kissed Kathy's forehead. I wish I felt as confident about this as you do, he said simply. He wanted to, but the tormenting what-ifs were stronger than her optimism. 2 nights later, Paul and Kathy were alone in the apartment. Kathy finished wiping off the counter and shut the overhead lights off. Want some fresh coffee? She asked, lifting the full decanter. "Sure," Paul said, shuffling over in stocking feet. "Let's call that number tonight while both kids are gone," Kathy suggested. Paul took the hot mug from her outstretched hand and pulled out a chair at the table. "On one condition," he said, holding up his forefinger. "I'm not here, okay?" he instructed Kathy, holding her gaze with his deep brown eyes. "I'm not ready to talk," he stressed. "Do not let on that I'm home." Kathy tossed her long blonde hair behind her shoulders, nodding. "I got it," she sighed. She glanced at the slip of paper with the phone number and pressed the buttons. "Hello?" A man's voice answered on the second ring. "Hi," Kathy began. "My name is Kathy Summers, and I'm married to a man who could possibly be your brother." "Yeah, we got a call from someone the other night," he acknowledged. "We've been waiting for someone to call back." "Oh, good," Kathy said with relief. At least he appeared open to the conversation. "My husband's name is Paul Summers. We've always known he was adopted, but recently we found a letter that listed his birth name as Arlen Fay LaRoche." "Arlen Fay? My mother's name was Bessie Arlene LaRoche," he said with sincere hopefulness. "But she always went by Arlene." "According to the records at St. Mary's Hospital, the birth parents are listed as Bessie Arlene LaRoche and Fred Daniel LaRoche," she continued. "Oh, I can't believe I have a brother," he suddenly exclaimed. "Those are my folks." The awkward conversation soon turned into a series of rapid questions back and forth. "So your real name is Frederick?" Kathy asked. "But you go by Fritz, okay? Uh-huh." Kathy repeated bits and pieces for Paul's benefit. "There's a sister in Pierre." "Oh, yes." "His adopted name is Paul Edward Summers." Too nervous to sit, Paul paced the short distance between the living room and the dining room. He longed to hear both sides of the conversation, but there was still a cloud of anxiousness hanging over him. "You must be older than Paul, then?" Kathy asked. "Let's see. My birthday is October 3rd, 1956, Fritz said. "Well, wait. Paul was born in 1955. So you're younger than Paul?" Kathy inquired. "That doesn't make sense. You said he was born in 55. I'm 37. Now I'm confused. Wait a minute," Kathy answered, turning to Paul. "Paul, what year were you born?" Paul's jaw dropped, and he waved his hands, reminding Kathy he wasn't there. But it was too late. Time stood still momentarily as Kathy locked eyes with Paul. "He wants to talk to you, Paul," she said, handing him the receiver. Now came the moment of truth. Paul reached out a hand and took it from her. He swallowed hard and cleared his throat. "Hello," he said cautiously. "Hey, bro," Fritz replied. "You're Sue," he announced, followed by a warm, friendly laugh. As the realization of the words washed over him, Paul glanced down at his arms and hands. Hands that he'd watched fly over the keyboards thousands of times. Hands that held his newborn children. Hands that loved to caress Kathy's hair as she slept. Was it his imagination, or did they suddenly look browner than ever before?